Hi guys, in this video I'm going to go and analyze the poem Exposure written by Wilfred Owen, and the first thing we need to know is the context for this poem. So just quickly, Owen was a soldier in World War I and wrote this poem before he died, and he was in the trenches whilst he was doing that. And a lot of the soldiers died in the trenches because of the harsh weather conditions. This poem explores the after effects of war, including the trauma and the suffering. And Owen is exploring his anger at war's futility, how it's a waste of life, and the horrible conditions of war. So that's the first thing we need to know. So that was the context. And now the next thing that we need to look at is the form of this poem. Now it's in the present tense. It is in first person, and there's a regular rhyme with a collective voice. So that is the form of this poem. Now notice how even if it's in the first person, it's in plural. So Owen is not just writing from his perspective, he's writing as if he's a part of a group. So he's saying we and our, so that he's using words like that. And the next thing we look at is the attitude. So the main attitudes here is suffering, hopelessness, and boredom. And these attitudes are constantly presented throughout the poem. So we need to keep a lookout for these three attitudes. Now, there is quite a lot of poems that we can link it to. So I'm going to write the list and then I'll explain it. So here is the list, and it is Charge of the Light Brigade, Bayonet Charge, Storm on the Island, London, and Remains. Now, notice how a lot of these poems that link to exposure link to war. So Charge of the Light Brigade, Bayonet Charge, and Remains. And then Storm on the Island and London are looking at, so London is looking at the absence of hope. So you can link that here, where there's hopelessness. And Storm on the Island is one of the poems that focuses on the power of nature. And in this poem, nature is seemingly the actual enemy and not the people on the other side. So that is the list of poems that we can link to. So we've looked at the context, we've looked at the form of the poem, we've looked at attitudes and the poems that this poem can also link to. So now we need to go through a quick summary just before we start to annotate. So Exposure is all about soldiers in trenches of World War I who are awake at night and they are scared of an enemy attack. And their main enemy is nature. So it's windy, it's freezing, cold. It's like very harsh weather conditions. And the men are imagining going home, but all the doors are shut. And they believe that sacrificing themselves is the only way to keep their loved ones safe. So that was a quick summary. If you want to, if you don't understand the context or the summary of this poem, there are separate videos on this channel on the context and summary. I will put them in the description box, so if you want to look at those, go ahead. So now what we're going to do is go through the poem Exposure, and here is the first quote. So the first quote I'm zooming in on is the very first line of the poem, and it says, "Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us." Now this is personification, and it's highlighting how nature is an enemy and it's a weapon that the soldiers need to fight. And there's a little bit of confusion because the soldiers are now feeling like so they don't know who they're trying to fight. Are they trying to fight the weather or are they trying to fight the enemy? So it's an invisible constant threat, and it's unbiased as it's a killer for everyone. So it's a killer for even the enemy. So that's a very key quote that we should analyze in this poem. So there is the explanation. I've just written it down. Now the next quote is the last line of the stanza, and it is, "But nothing happens." Now, this is a repeated motif throughout the poem, and is repeated quite a few times. And it highlights how war is pointless, yet the soldiers suffer eternally, and that war has no outcome. Where it says, but nothing happens, they're waiting, and there's no outcome. So there's, again, here, we can link it to the attitude of boredom. So that's quite key. So that is what we would write for that quote. And now we're going to move on to the next quote. So this quote says, sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. Now, this is in the 4th stanza. Remember, these are not the only quotes that you can pick for your analysis. These are just the ones that I would pick. So this is sibilance, repetition of the S sound. And it's quite sinister. So the wind is stronger than the bullets. That's what it's highlighting and emphasizing. So again, if we look here, it says, but nothing happens. And at the end of this stanza, but nothing happens. So that repeated motif of boredom and eternal suffering, and that war has no outcome, is a constant theme. It's a constant, so something that we can take away from this poem is that war is pointless, yet the soldiers are constantly suffering. Now the next quote that we're going to look at is quite important. So this quote says, shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. Now there's repetition of closed here and here. And it's highlighting that there's nothing that can save them. So there's no exit from war. And because everything is closed, their hope is lost. So the attitude of hopelessness is here again. Actually, this is one of the attitudes of hopelessness. So the hope is lost, and the door is a division from society. So once they're in war, once they're fighting, there is no way back. So they cannot come back from war. And the next quote that I'm going to look at is the end of the next stanza, where it says, for the love of God seems dying. Now, this is religious imagery, and it could highlight the doubt which is caused by the isolation. So there's no one to turn to, they've been betrayed. So their faith has been stripped away from them. That is why it says, so God's love for them is dying. This is what they're feeling. So they're at war, there's a constant motif of boredom, suffering eternally, war has no outcome. We can see that there's a lot of but nothing happens. There's like a motif of that phrase at the end of quite a few stanzas. So here, this is religious imagery, and they're casting doubt on their faith. So they're losing faith in God. I would say that is one of the kind of key quotes from this poem, because they're fighting in war, they have no one to turn to, they're isolated, they're suffering, the weather is literally ripping them to shreds. They don't just have one enemy, they have 2 enemies, and in the trenches the conditions are so bad. Lots and lots of soldiers are dying. It's just they see war as pointless. So Owen sees war as pointless, and he's saying that war can possibly lead to your faith being lost, because you feel so betrayed and you have no one to turn to. Now I just want to focus on the very, very last line of this poem, and we can see that it says, but nothing happens. Again here, it's the same phrase, but nothing happens. So again, it's a motif, it's a repeated motif of how war is pointless. So Owen is constantly implementing this idea that there is no point of war, it is very futile, it's waste of life, and because of the horrible conditions, there's just no point. So even at the end, he has stamped his poem and he said, you know what, there is no point of war. So that is very key, as even the end of the poem ends in, but nothing happens. So again, hopelessness, boredom, suffering. These attitudes are constantly coming in, and we need to write these in your essays to gain full marks. So you need to put in how Owen is angry at war's futility and how it's a waste of life, which is why he constantly implements the attitudes of boredom, hopelessness, and suffering. And he says that the after effects of war and the trauma and suffering is completely pointless, and you don't have one enemy, you actually have two. And the second enemy, weather, is actually affecting both sides of both soldier troops. So one from one side and one from the other side. Both the enemy and Owen's team of soldiers are both being affected by the weather. So this is a very, very key quote. Now, as you can see, I've actually underlined hopelessness. This is one of the three attitudes, and I think you can zoom in on this and say that they feel hopeless because there's no one to turn to. So they've lost their faith, they've lost their chances of going home because all the doors are shut. There's no exit from war. They've been divided from society, so they've become hopeless. This is why war is pointless, and there's so much suffering and boredom. And Owen he's literally highlighting and emphasizing how horrible the conditions of war actually are, because he was one of the soldiers in World War One. So that was Exposure by Wilfred Owen. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Thank you very much for watching.